Okay, good afternoon all. सबैजनालाई नमस्ते. पहिला चाहिँ मलाई यो कार्यक्रममा निमन्त्रणा दिनुभयो र सानो प्रस्तुतिकरण राख्ने अवसर दिनुभएकोमा क्लाइमेट्स नेपाल र विशेष गरी प्रकृतिलाई म हार्दिक धन्यवाद दिन चाहन्छु. प्रकृतिले नै मलाई खबर गरेर हामीले यस्तो कार्यक्रम गर्न लागेका छौं भन्ने पछि मैले पनि हुन्छ नि त शेयर गरौँ भनेर यो कार्यक्रममा सहभागी भएको छु. 10 मिनेटको समय जस्तो लागेको छ मलाई. So I'll try to make my presentation within that given time. Participantहरु सबैलाई शेयर भएको छ होला what I'll be talking on in today's program. It is about climate change and biodiversity in Nepal and where is our science. यो प्रस्तुतिकरण को यो शीर्षक किन राखेको भन्दाखेरि हामी क्लाइमेट चेन्जको बारेमा धेरै कुरा गर्छौं, क्याम्पेनहरु गर्छौं, विभिन्न सभा सम्मेलनहरुमा बोलिरहेको हुन्छौं. तर प्रश्न के भन्दाखेरि हाम्रो वैज्ञानिक आधार के छ, विशेष गरी नेपालको सन्दर्भमा. यो चाहिँ तपाईहरु जस्तो क्लाइमेट्स नेपालमा आबद्ध भएका विद्यार्थीहरु अथवा क्लाइमेट एक्टिभिस्टहरु अथवा क्लाइमेट क्याम्पेनर्सहरु समक्ष एक किसिमको डिस्कसन गरौं, एक किसिमको अन्तर्क्रिया गरौं भनेर मैले यो शीर्षकमा आज प्रस्तुतिकरण दिँदैछु. र हामी विशेष गरी तपाईहरुको कार्यक्रमको मैले उद्देश्यहरु हेरेको थिए. ती उद्देश्यहरु हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ अलिकति बढी अन्तर्क्रिया गर्ने उद्देश्य राखेर आयोजना गर्नुभएको कार्यक्रम. त्यसकारणले मैले आफ्नो प्रस्तुतिकरण छोटो समयमा सकेर अन्तर्क्रिया र छलफललाई नै प्राथमिकता दिने गरी मैले आफ्नो प्रस्तुतिकरण यहाँ सुरु गर्न चाहे. सबैले सुन्नु भएको छ है? मेरो स्क्रिन पनि देख्नु भएको होला?
एकदम सर सुनिरहेको छौं हामीले.
ओके, केही समस्या भयो भने खबर गर्नु होला. Then
sure sir.
I'll okay. So let me begin my presentation. What I'll be talking on in this presentation, I am showing here in this slide. र यसलाई चाहिँ तपाईले मेरो प्रस्तुतिकरणको conclusion को रूपमा पनि लिन सक्नुहुन्छ. So I am beginning with the conclusion of my presentation. So we all know that Nepal exhibits abrupt ecological and climatic transitions. There are lots of variations when we talk about the ecology of Nepal, when we talk about the climate of Nepal. Okay. And another important aspect when we talk about Nepal and its ecology and its climate is there are some of the poorest people who largely depend on ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, for example, agriculture, agro-ecosystem services, for example, forest ecosystem services, for example, grassland ecosystem services, and so on. And for all these services to be provisioned, reliability of climate is extremely important. So that is the reason why we need to talk about climate, why we need to talk about its impacts on ecology and biodiversity in Nepal. When I went through the research, then a very interesting thing I found in last days through several literature survey, and what I found is there are a handful of climatological papers. There are numerous, in fact, but the papers which highlight the effects or the impacts of climate change on biological diversity are minimal globally, and it is very pronounced. The disparity is very pronounced for South Asia, and Nepal is a part of it. So that's why we have to be careful, we have to be cautious, we have to be concerned while we talk about climate change, while we talk about climate change and its impact on the biological diversity in Nepal. So why there are few studies, few reliable studies, and why there is a gap? It is because the biological observations, they require on the ground field work, and the researchers should have aptitude in identifying the species, the population and communities and ecosystems, their functioning and so on. So this demands a rigorous exercise. So that may be the reason why we have not significant amount of research which show the impacts of climate change on our biodiversity. So I'll build on this overview, and I'll give some examples of what is happening when we talk about the climate change and biodiversity in Nepalese context. So I borrowed this picture, if you look into it, from the AR5 report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This picture shows two important aspects. On the left vertical axis, it shows the speed of the organisms that, or the speed at which species or the organism can move per decade, kilometer per decade. And on the right side, on vertical axis, it shows the speed at which the climate changes. So there are different scenarios, obviously. And when we carefully look into this picture, we can easily find that with minimum change scenario, even with minimum change scenario, there are several groups of organisms which cannot move sufficiently to adapt to the changes. So that is a bigger concern. That is a bigger concern for all of us, because as I already talked about, we depend heavily on our ecological system for them to function well. So if the organism cannot adapt, or if they fail to adapt, then there will be question in the ecosystem functioning, meaning we have to compromise on the ecosystem services that we derive for our subsistence, for our living, for our economy, for our society, and so on. So it is where we need to be concerned about. So let me talk about Nepalese context. Where is our science when we talk about climate change and biological diversity? The climatological paper, they are numerous. There are many. And research on species and communities, they are fairly common, but they are not enough. So the research that are done so far, they are skewed towards high altitude floral species, high altitude populations and communities. They are skewed towards this. Then there are a handful of research on responses of individual species and their distribution shift, what we call the range shift. These kind of research, they are very common. But there is a critical gap when we talk about the impacts of climate change on faunal species. There are only few species for which the impacts of climate change are available for us to study, and they belong to the charismatic species. For example, there are a few research on snow leopard, tigers, rhinoceros, and elephants. But there are no research. There are virtually no information about the impacts of climate change on other non-charismatic faunal species. And the most important thing that I discovered is that research at organism level, they are completely missing. So I'll be talking about what we understand by research at organism level later, but I want to tell you that there are no research at all which investigate the impact of climate change at organism level. So what are studies at species level we have? As I told you, there are studies on rand shifts, there are studies on changes in distribution, considering the future climatic scenarios. There are handful, there are good amount of research in this aspect. There are some research on population level impacts as well. For example, the impacts of climate change on tree growth, the requirement rates, and so on. But what we need to understand is, how do species interact with each other? And how do the impacts of climate change influence such interactions? Because species interactions are very important to understand, as they manifest community level changes, such as compositions and productivity. Because we depend on productivity for our livelihood, for our subsistence. So understanding the impacts of climate change at this level means what will happen to species composition, what will happen to productivity at that level is very important for us. But there are certain gaps in this aspect as well. There are few research on, very few in fact, on community level impacts, especially on changes in species compositions and changes in phenology. However, how do such changes, how do those impacts affect the patterns of productivity? That is missing. So this is another critical gap when we talk about the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in Nepalese context. And there is no study documenting the changes in interspecific interactions as a response to climate change. There are several studies when we go through the interspecific interactions in Australian ecosystems or in European ecosystems, in American ecosystem, and so on. But in Nepalese context, in our context, even in Himalayan context, this sort of research, it is lacking. So why it is so? Why there are no research? As I told you earlier, we need to have a long-term kind of commitment, long-term kind of dedication and perseverance to study these things. So, and another reason, we do not have, substantial number of community ecologists. So that is where I want to aware you. We need to have the community ecologist. We need to have ecosystem ecologist. We need to have to carry out research at this level if we are to understand the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in totality. We have information about some species at individual level. But what we know is community or ecosystem, it is a very complex entity. So the influence of or the interaction of one individual, one species to another is very important. And we know that different species respond to environment differently. One species respond rapidly to the changing climate, and other species fail to respond, fail to adapt. So what is the impact in totality? So that is where we do not have knowledge. That is where there is no science in the police context. So it is where we can focus our research on. Okay. So I earlier talked that there are no research at organism level impacts. So what does this mean? This means the research at organism level would involve genetic, physiological, and morphological research. And there is no research in Nepal to talk about the impacts of climate change on genetic composition of a single species. So there is complete absence of research in our level. So what does this mean? After all, it suggests a need for more research on horticology of Nepalese flora and fauna, and considering the changes due to regional and or global climatic changes. So it is where we need to work on. And what we need to know, we need to develop a long-term ground-based research with study on populations and individuals, organisms, especially focusing on the physiological thresholds of a species, and also understanding the evolutionary changes that will be altered by the ongoing regional or global climatic changes. For example, I think all of you know the vulnerability of Nepal when we talk about the invasive species. So what will happen in due course of time when the ongoing climate change is continued? What will be the impacts of these invasive species on our native species? So it is where we need to plan research. It is where we do not have science to talk about. You know? This is where we should focus our research in future. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I want to tell you that there are opportunities in front of us for significant, much needed long-term research at organism level to study the impacts of ongoing climate change at organism level, to study the impacts of ongoing climate change on physiological thresholds and population dynamics of species, and most importantly, the changes to the productivity and distribution of ecosystem. So we need a research that provide a broader understanding of how regional and or global climatic changes will affect the valuable biodiversity. The biodiversity is very important to us. You know, currently more than 60% of Nepalese population is directly dependent on agriculture. Even in agriculture, there are important, knowledge gap. There is gap in science, even in agriculture, and importantly. So I hope the next presenter will elucidate on it more. And at the end, what I want to say is we are doing something when we talk about climate change and its impact on biological diversity. And we are at the beginning level. We are at the very basic level of our research. There are lots of things that are changing, and they are changing very rapidly. It is the rate at which we have to be concerned about. So if we fail to develop research, if we fail to generate knowledge, generate science with that pace, it will be very difficult for us to manage the effects or the impacts of climate change. So I think I conclude with that. So thank you